This Easy Gap video series is brought to you by Chico State's Colleges of Natural Sciences and Agriculture and the Center for Healthy Communities, and is partially funded by the CSU Agricultural Research Institute. This video is land assessment. The first step in putting together your documented food safety plan is assessing the area where you grow your food. This allows you to determine if there are any potential hazards that could be affecting the land. In this video, we'll talk about how to assess your land, including any previous animal use, flooding, and any adjacent land use that could present food safety risks. There are 4 food safety documents you will see in this video. You can click on the links on the website to access the documents yourself. At the end of the video, we'll show you how they fit into your on-farm food safety plan. While your policies and procedures play a major role in keeping your food safe, it is important to consider other aspects which may impact your growing operation. Even if you have safe food practices, foodborne illness could result from contamination from adjacent land or previous land use. Performing an assessment of your land allows you to lessen this risk. There are 2 main components to address when assessing ground history: previous animal use or access, and flooding. If land was previously used for livestock production or grazing, there should be a sufficient buffer time before the land is used to grow crops for human consumption. The buffer time is dependent upon the risk that certain activities entail. For example, using livestock to graze orchards will pose a lower risk than using grazing to clean up crop residue, which is a higher risk scenario. A risk evaluation should be performed on any land where there was previous animal use. The evaluation should include details on how the land was used and any risk reduction steps taken to reduce the risk of contamination of crops. The crop area should be free of any systematic animal fecal contamination. For example, there should be no evidence of fecal material in the area from flocks, herds, or other groups of animals, including pets. If systematic animal contamination is found during the growing season, the affected area, along with visible buffer zones, should not be harvested. Produce that has come into direct contact with fecal material should not be harvested, and a 5-foot radius no harvest zone should be implemented unless adequate measures have been taken to reduce the risk of possible contamination. If flooding from uncontrolled sources occurred during the previous growing season, you must have documented evidence that corrective actions were taken with regard to the land and product. Keep in mind that flooding refers to the flowing or overflowing of a field with water outside of your control that is reasonably likely to contain microorganisms of significant health risk. Documentation, including sketched maps or photographs, should be kept as proof of what area the flooding was contained within. The flooded area should not be planted with crops for human consumption for at least 60 days once the ground has dried out, unless soil testing has occurred. If soil testing is performed, suitable representative samples should be collected for the entire area suspected to have been exposed. Soil testing must indicate that the levels of microorganisms are lower than the standards for processed compost. If the results indicate the soil is not contaminated, the replanting time can be reduced to 30 days. If flooding occurs during the growing season, the affected produce and produce within 30 feet of the flooding should not be harvested for human consumption. Most contract labs will provide a sterile container or bag to take your sample in. Label the container with the location as precisely as possible. Also include the time, date, and the initials of the person taking the sample. Determine the number of samples by taking into account the size of the area. Locations that have different drainage, soil types, and crop types will need to be sampled separately. For a single field, you will want to collect soil from various sections of the field to obtain a representative sample. Before you begin collecting your sample, determine where these points will be. Usually this will require 12 to 16 different points in the field, which you will mix in a bucket. Your contract lab can help you determine how many locations in the field you should use for your sample. Before sampling, make sure to wash your hands or use gloves to prevent contamination. Using a sterilized trowel, spade, or similar device, take a thin vertical slice of soil from the surface to about 6 inches into the ground. Place the sample in a clean bucket. When the samples have been taken from each point, mix the soil well. Fill the sample tube or bag provided by the contract laboratory with a portion of the soil and securely seal the container. If you're sampling from multiple field locations for different samples, make sure you wear clean gloves at each location or wash your hands between the locations. After collecting the sample from each field location, place the sample on ice in a cooler. Transport the sample on ice to your contract laboratory as soon as possible. Most labs will have a time limit on how long you have between sample collection and delivery at the lab in order to ensure a valid test result. If land adjacent to the growing area is a potential source of contamination, appropriate measures must be taken to reduce the risk. When assessing this risk, it is important to consider the topography of the land for runoff, potential flooding issues, and prevailing winds for manure related to dust issues. If commercial livestock are adjacent to the growing area, a buffer of approximately 400 feet should be maintained. For domesticated or grazing animals, a buffer of approximately 30 feet should be sufficient to decrease the risk of contamination. The distance may increase or decrease depending on the topography of the land. For example, if the crop area is uphill from the animals, the distance can be decreased, but if the crop area is downhill from the animals, the distance should be increased. Runoff from animal waste should be diverted by trenching or similar land preparation. Other methods may include vegetative strips, windbreaks, physical barriers, fences, and diversion ditches to prevent or control runoff. It is also important to consider if the growing area is situated near other locations which may pose a risk to crops, such as fertilizer storage and application areas, runoff or potential flooding from sewers, toilet systems, or industrial facilities. Other higher risk locations include any operation or activity which could cause physical, microbiological, or chemical contamination or pollution. If the growing area is adjacent to a higher risk location, appropriate measures must be taken to reduce the risk. This includes using buffers around crops of approximately 30 to 400 feet depending on the level of risk, the activity, or the operation. Very high-risk activities include compost and organic fertilizer areas. Protective measures to use include buffer distances, physical barriers, fences, or ditches. Your written food safety plan should include an SOP on risk evaluation procedures. It should also include an SOP for soil sampling procedures and a log to document any soil testing results. Records of assessments and test results should be maintained for 3 years. Samples of all of these documents can be found on the website. Just remember to update the content so that it has the correct information for your farm. By evaluating the risk of potential crop contamination through assessment of your land, you are able to document that you are following safe practices. The documents discussed in this video are available on our website to help you put together your on-farm food safety plan. All food safety policies and procedures should be developed using national, state, and local guidelines. Therefore, no responsibility is assumed or implied by CSU Chico Research Foundation or CSU Chico.